My name is Roland Green. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in gender and entrepreneurship here at Aarhus University in Denmark. And I'm really happy to be here and to contribute to the session that you're having as part of the debuting project on gender and business models. From at least the end of the dot-com crash in the early 2000s, there's been this acute focus on business models as a kind of functional expression of an enterprise's inner workings. Now, more critical and sociological views are still rarely maintained, really, in management literature. We're most likely to get a question like this one from a scholar you should see on the screen about whether business models are just, quote, rituals that may just fulfill at best some symbolic function, but that lack a genuine economic meaning. Statements like this come without much curiosity about the power of the symbolism or the ritualization that's described here. Now, I think this is particularly important for minority positions which have built their disciplines on the exploration of dominant symbols. So we know that modern gender studies, for instance, kind of first cut its teeth, really, on literary and textual analysis. But in the gender and entrepreneurship domain, we seem to make much more out of sort of inductively studying women's new venture creation, much more than we do analyzing the business model as a kind of gendered text. So supposedly up to 50% of all entrepreneurship articles published since 2009 have been claimed to focus on gender. But in this context, I think the lack of attention to a gendered interrogation of the business model form itself seems like a missed opportunity. So in this presentation, I'm going to offer some initial ideas about investigating that situation and trying to make it relevant for both future research and for the practice that is involved in running SMEs and in the contexts that you are operating in. So let's first establish some common terms on business models as a genre. They seem to map the unique trade-offs of a firm. They try to link the workings, the inside workings of the firm to outside elements, including the customer side. There's a quote there, including how value is created and how it's monetized. Whilst business models were generally considered to be fixed expressions of a company's going concern, there's a current trend for ongoing innovations and changes to the mapping itself. So there's an entire literature really that sprung up around how entrepreneurs make tweaks to the metrics of their model, including its value proposition, its operational value, its financial value, and its human capital. Changes are made here to maintain competitive advantage and to adapt to new conditions, often through experiments incubated in internal processes before being externally visible in the business model itself. I think if we think broadly, more broadly perhaps, about where does this idea of the business model as a transparent sort of input-output map come from? My hunch is that it fills a void that firms themselves have created for strategic reasons. Let's go somewhere completely different. In Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the confectionery industrialist Willy Wonka wrestles with having his inventions stolen by undercover workers. He closes the factory and disappears. Several years later, the factory begins working again, but with a mysterious self-sufficiency. As Grandpa Joe says to Charlie, nobody ever goes in, nobody ever comes out. Now, Dahl's full explanation in the novel reveals a fundamental change in Wonka's business model. On foreign travels, Wonka's discovered the Oompa Loompa tribe, and he brings them back to work in the factory as quasi-slaves. This is Dahl's parody of mid-20th century imperial political economy, and whilst it's rather unreconstructed, it nevertheless, I think, tells us something important about narratives of entrepreneurial change. We seem to expect business models to change, to soak in the values of their period and time, but also for firms to hide the reality of these alterations. And to my students, for instance, the business model has this explanatory power to lift the lid on the true business dealings that are happening. In reality, of course, for companies like Meta, then Facebook, the actual business model of surveillance capitalism, for instance, is helpfully smothered by the presentation of it being a social media company as businesses sort of building communities. The same seems to occur here in the Dahl narrative, and I think it tells us something important about the use of the business model to hide and construct a particular version of general changes and actions that would occur in any organization. Now, if we start to question the gender of the contours of the business model form, let's briefly consider where women's entrepreneurship intersects with some of these issues. Now, the influence of the market and business as capitalist entities have made various depths of influence on women's entrepreneurship research. Many current studies emphasize a sort of post-feminist movement in which values of choice, empowerment, and individuation have replaced the idea of women's collective structural position from socialist and radical feminist work of the 70s and 80s. Yet, against this choice, or sometimes called market feminist approach, there are still sectorial divisions between the genders that remain firmly entrenched and continue to need explanation, really. As this theorist puts it, men tend to be overrepresented in primary sectors characterized by the highest productivity and the best working prospects, whilst women tend to be overrepresented in secondary sectors that often offer limited opportunities for professional development. So the easiest way, I think, of combining the market feminist positioning with an acknowledgement of gender as constructed by practices is to consider the sort of the stickiness of gendered values to our ideas about business models and innovation, how much they seem to be bound up with each other, those discourses. So Brun and Jensen collate several positions from feminist and entrepreneurship research to create this matrix, which highlights masculinized and feminized qualities in relation to innovation and leadership styles. And I'll use this as sort of a backdrop for some of the later analysis I demonstrate in the presentation. But a few points to identify here, I think. First, they consider that there's this creative and expressive quality of action, what they call innovation here, as the basis of feminine values, coded feminine values in Western society, even though the spaces of business innovation we still see in general are largely dominated by men. Secondly, they characterize the masculine value basis in terms of this sort of quality criteria, evoking the idea of judgments and evaluations. Now, it's interesting then to consider what the business model does as a fixed text that is seeming to identify innovation and change, but is also used as a measuring and monitoring tool and a tool for evaluation that one then needs to be able to make changes in the organization later down the line. So, where does women's entrepreneurship literature begin to indicate relevant gendered differences in business model innovation? Firstly, women are more strongly represented in the non-profit sector and in social forms of entrepreneurship, matched by a stronger visibility in public sector innovation. Now, whilst even the public sector context brings typical hurdles to innovation, such as having a low risk orientation, women are shown as more likely to develop business models that are responsive in some ways to societal impact. Secondly, women founders and enterprise leaders show a great and potentially greater use of a wider variety of resources than has often been recognized. Business model innovation can be internally driven by product and service innovation, filtered through some necessarily external-facing systems, such as marketing tools, retail opportunities, and changes in pricing. As Lopez-Nichols and others explore, women entrepreneurs are particularly adept at these ways of anticipating and sort of translating customer experience into internal systems, drawing on the skills that make women leaders in personal branding and brand consciousness much higher represented. These forms of resource and opportunity identification are found to be different from men's in the literature, but no less innovative. That's the important criteria, really. Feminist perspectives on resources also, of course, have something to say as part of a longer history about such resources, particularly in relation to technology. So notably that whenever women have expanded access to a particular infrastructure or increased the nodes in a networked form of innovation, it's male entrepreneurs and masculine industries the ones that specialize more and privatize the technology, that have managed to sort of sift out the wider resources that its female founders had established. That's the history of ICT and early computing. And it just demonstrates the way that the choices around resource allocation are still highly gendered in the way that we consider how innovation has occurred through at least 20th century history. Thirdly, this comfort with resource mixing that I just mentioned reflects also a capacity for hybridity in business models, reflected, I think, in the prominence of women in the leadership of social enterprises, which are inherently hybrid resource organizations. Children and family are also found to be a positively disposing element to drawing women towards entrepreneurship. And family firms are more likely to be able to maintain and prioritize the sustainability interests that draw more women generally to entrepreneurship. We can even see this hybridity playing out in the expression of values within gendered sectors, I think. For example, whilst much is made often of women entrepreneurs as kind of practices of cooperation more than competition, research actually indicates there's this paradoxical pressure that, quote, firms owned and managed by women tend to be in sectors where competitive intensity is higher. So maintaining cooperative ideals is a challenge, therefore. It might be the more natural propensity for women entrepreneurs, the more likely default, but the sectors in which they operate actually push towards alternative notions of competitiveness. So how are these things maintained? They require a kind of leadership that acknowledges and supports hybridity, conflict, and some form of resolution in there. Fourthly, women entrepreneurs in many contexts show more of an interest in continuity over growth, the research shows, and loyalty to both employees and customers rather than kind of radical changes. So most work on business model innovation indicates that if you modify this map over time, it has a net positive on the performance of the venture. So to be changing and alert and attentive to the business model and how much it needs to change actually is a positive performance indicator for women entrepreneurs, that they are shown to be more likely to undertake that kind of attentiveness to change in the business model. So for now, I've identified 5 main themes across the subject of business models that resonate with research on women's entrepreneurship. Now, if we put this in the context of the model that I showed at the beginning, and with a post-structural view on gender that's much more about gender as a discourse that is attached to certain practices rather than something that is inherently bound up with biological situatedness, then we'd say what I've described is feminine coded approaches to business model design that are therefore more likely to be, as I listed, public sector oriented, resource rich, embracing of organizational hybridity, valuing longer term kinds of growth processes, and with an innovation style potentially more of interpretation rather than generation.